couple of points that I should have made and did not. And the first point is just why not selecting? That's not good. The first point is the Ark of the Covenant. So if you were to ask a Hebrew person, where's God? They would say in the Ark of the Covenant. You know, we would say heaven or something like that. They were very clear. They knew exactly where God was. He was in the Ark of the Covenant. So when they talk about the Ark of the Covenant going around in front of battles and stuff, that is literally God leading them into battles. So that's how that would be looked at. And the second thing on this slide to bring up is there was a big debate, if you will, in Samuel about whether they should have a king or not have a king. And God said, you don't need a king. I'm your king. You should trust me. You should let God be the king. And the people clamored and clamored. And finally, God said, okay, if you want a king, here's your king. And he gave him Saul and then David and so forth and so on. So they were led by kings from that point on. And, you know, just to make the point to move forward to the New Testament where they wanted to make Jesus king, he said, no, that's not what it's about at all. So clearly, you know, kings and God are not really the way God intended the Bible to go. I gotta push this button. All right. So this just a very busy, and it just shows King David, and just shows his victories and how he expanded the kingdom, and you know, he just won battle after battle after battle, and everything went great until the Bathsheba story, and then after that, nothing really went that well for him. So, but it does show that the dynasty of King David, that his offspring would rule forever. So that's the other part of this particular slide. All right. So let's go to this week. Get it right here. Trying to bring up my other screen here. Please go away. What I'm screen sharing that I wanted to share. I just shared my email. There we go. All right, so this is this week's. So this one talks about King Solomon built his temple. So if you looked at the temple is like 90 feet long and 30 feet wide. It wasn't a huge structure even by ancient structures. But the temple, again, if you were to ask when the temple's built, they put the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies between two cherubim. And again, if you were to ask Hebrew people, where's God? God is in the Ark of the Covenant, which is in the Holy of Holies. So just very clearly, they understood that's where God was. So Solomon, you know, he starts off really good. You know, I want to be wise. I want to, that's God. Oh, that's great, Solomon. That's wonderful. You'd be the wisest king ever. And he starts off real wise. But then power corrupts. And Solomon became very corrupted. And he had a ridiculous number of wives and concubines. And he allowed the worship of all of the wives and concubines, their other gods, some of which are quite horrific, child sacrifice kind of gods. And so Solomon is not looked upon that favorably from a biblical perspective. He built this temple, which, a centerpiece of Judaism, and he built his palace. And if you go through, especially chapters 3, 4, then 5 through 10, just story after story of how ridiculously wealthy he was. Just the money was in, and there was gold flowing everywhere, and everything was gold plated, and it was all great. Until you're led to understand that he did that by taxing his people to the point of slavery. So, these people would be subsistence farmers or subsistence shepherds. They didn't have extra money. So any hardship, taxes or tithes that they had to pay to the temple it was a burden on them. And then when the taxes had to go up to pay for his building program, because the money has to come from somewhere, right? So the people are taxed more to pay for the temple and his building house. And then King Hiram needs help cutting down all those trees in Lebanon. So Solomon conscripts 30,000 men. And he says that 1 month out of 3, they have to go to Lebanon and harvest the trees and bring them down for his building project. And so they have 2 months at home and 1 month in Lebanon, of course, not getting paid for that. That would be free labor because he was the king and they were building it, for Jerusalem, if you will. So you can imagine, if you're a subsistence farmer and 1 month out of 3, you're away from home, not making money. So obviously the people were going into debt, and the debts were such that they started to lose their land, which was just beyond belief. And it got to the point where they had to sell their sons and daughters into slavery, just to put food on the table. And that's what they did. So Solomon did those things. The good side, he built a temple. The bad side is he oppressed the people to the point of enslaving his own people so that they lost the land that God had given them, as they settled in the promised land. So it was ancestral land, and he just stole from them because he was the king, and kings do what they want. So when Solomon dies, he has his son Jeroboam to replace him. And the people of the northern tribes, which those are the ones that were enslaved, those are the ones whose land was stolen. Jeroboam went up to them and said, "Hey, I'm the king." And they said, "You're not going to be the king unless you treat us better than Solomon." And Solomon goes to his old elders, and the elders say, "Yeah, you should lighten your load. It's just too much." And then he went to the young guys and said, "Oh, we should double their load." And that's what he told them. So the kingdom split. Well, now there's a kingdom in the north called Israel, and there's a kingdom in the south called Judah. So they're no longer a united people. And if you could see, the northern kingdom has the Jordan River in its valley and the Sea of Galilee in it, and Judah has the desert. So all of the wealth and money and prosperity is in the northern kingdom. That's where the resources were. So the Judah had Jerusalem. That's what it had. And that was its moneymaker, if you will. And we can see at the bottom here, which shows the idols again. That idol worship was here it is. The idol worship was part of what was going on, and that we saw this week as we went through that idol worship was the biggest deal of what we've read so far. That's what the story has it, that God was just beyond angry about from time to time, and punishing them and all that kind of stuff. So they really struggled to worship God and not worship idols. So when the kingdoms broke off, there was a civil war, which the northern kingdom won because that's where the people lived, resources were, much like the American Civil War would have been. It was the North had all the resources and the South had, in this case, the desert. But it wasn't a fair fight. So they parted company and were never a united kingdom again. Not until 1947, when the United Nations reinvented Israel in the Middle East, was there a country there again that was united in such a fashion. All right. So there are two places here, and one in Bethel and one up here in Dan, where the northern kingdom built their own temples, and they put golden calves in them. And what you read was like those golden calves are blasphemous, or the most horrible things ever done. And truth be told, where would they go? Right? I mean, it's like Jerusalem is in Judah now, so now it's not in the same country. So when they were all together, people in the north would come down and contribute their monies to the temple. They would pay their temple taxes. They would sacrifice, bring animals there for sacrifice and whatnot. And it was a big money maker. The temple it's always been a big money maker. It's as much that as it is anything religious. So, we tend to think of these temples as like St. Luke's Lutheran Church. No, they're not. They're really not. Although worship did go on there to some level, much more complex. So the people in the north weren't going to take their resources across the border into Judah, right? There's no payback in that. They have their own system now. So they built these temples and they put these idols as we read. But truth be told, Yahweh was worshipped in these places. So everything that we read is these places are awful, they're an abomination, and blah, blah, blah. And that was because the people in Jerusalem weren't getting their take of it. So it's very political, right? So there were a lot going on, but these two things were shrines. And next week we're going to read about the prophets. We're finally getting to the good part of the Old Testament next week. So they had to have a place to worship, so they built one at the south and one at the north, and worked very well for the northern kingdom of Israel. Judah hated it. Judah wrote the story and called it just awful. All right. Oh, what else was there? They also had shrines for other gods on the hills of places. So some places that they talk about were, if you will, a good place for people to go and worship Yahweh. But others were not. Others were um, Baal worship or Molech worship or some other foreign god that they would go and worship there as well. So it was, what we read is very negative when in fact it was really politics. So much of that negativity is politics. So this just shows, up here they started with the tribal league, up here 12 tribes. Then they had a king, Saul and David, and Solomon. And see, David and Solomon get the big check marks. The writers of the Bible love them. And why did they love them? Because they worshiped and sacrificed in the temple in Jerusalem. That was the main thing that the writers of what we just read in First Kings, because they were of the temple system. So all of these people on the left are the kings of Judah, and they were all of the lineage of David. So even if some were assassinated, they would take another relative, if you will, of David and put them in their place. So it was one dynasty all the way through to the end, from 1,000 all the way down to 587 or 587 when the Southern Kingdom ended. So that's how long it lasted. It lasted from the divided kingdom from 922 to 587, and then it was no more. And you see some of the kings get check marks, some of them get X's. And the check marks are always about, and some of them had reforms and, we're actually trying to be good kings and, be good to the people and, let's all grow together, kind of stuff. Some of them were just awful people. But if they worshiped at the temple and sacrificed at the temple, they got check marks. On the other side, you see nobody gets a check mark. And these kings were just as good at being a king as the Southern kings were, which is not bragging rights by any stretch of the imagination. And most of these were just not nice people. But all of these, none of these get a check mark because they didn't respect the temple in Jerusalem. That was the key thing of the whole thing. So next week we're going to read about prophets, and most of those prophets are from the northern kingdom, and they had a lot to say about both kingdoms, truthfully. So these are all the different dynasties the northern kingdom had. So you can see, because they didn't have this understanding of the lineage of David that this side had, that they had different dynasties as time moved on. And this kingdom lasted until 721 BCE, at which time it was sometimes called Samaria because that was her capital. Sometimes it's called Israel, more than the prophets will call it Israel more than what the temple here called it. So the Bible will say that what we've read so far would say that they were punished because they didn't worship in Jerusalem and they worshiped idols. That's why the kingdom fell. Down here, they did worship in the temple, but they did worship other idols. And we'll get to that story. We'll get to the Bible of this in just a little bit. But that's kind of a big picture of what's going on here. So Assyria came and conquered Israel in 721. It took most of the men back to Assyria or to Aram and made them slaves. Assyrian men came to Samaria as soldiers and whatnot, and they ended up marrying the Hebrew women there. So when in Jesus' time they talk about the Samaritans, they were hated because they were not pure blood. They were they were a mix of Assyrian and Hebrew blood. That's why that's what carried on through the years. They didn't stay united with the kings of Judah. They didn't worship in Jerusalem. They worshiped in their own places, which was just a horrible thing to the people of Judah. It was, and they married foreign women, or their women married foreign men. I should say that right. And so in 721, they're carted off. In 721, or 722, can't remember exactly there, the Assyrians also came to Jerusalem, and the king of Judah had to pay the Assyrians to go away. So he took all the gold and everything in the temple, everything of value. They basically gave to the Assyrians and says, leave us alone. So the southern kingdom was much of a vassal state from this point on. The Bible doesn't bring that out very often or very clearly, but they were beholden to other kings throughout much of the rest of their time here. And finally, in 597, the Babylonians came down and took Zedekiah and his family hostage. They didn't take all the men, but they took all of the temple court and the king's court and took them to Babylon as hostages. And we're going to see that they took King Zedekiah to Babylon. They murdered all of his sons in front of him. And then they poked his eyes out so he couldn't see ever again. So that's how people were back then. Just horrible story. All right. Any questions on that? We're going to get into the Bible here in just a little bit. But so yeah, here's the slide that shows the kingdom split. It shows, the high places, and where there's a cow, that's kind of a good place. That's where they would sacrifice to Yahweh. And where it's burning, that would be where they were worshiping other gods. So that's kind of the theme here. But the big deal, and it was, these books were written by people who were obviously literate, and that pretty much meant they were of royal or priestly training. The average person couldn't read anything. So what we have here is the story written by the rich and powerful, right? That's who wrote, that's who writes history, right? Poor people, they don't write history, right? It's just, they wouldn't know how, they wouldn't know why to do it. They're just trying to live. So what we've read so far, including into tonight, is the people of power, the Hebrew people who had power, wrote these stories so that they're corrupted, if you will, Other politics, just as you would expect, right? So there's stories about where God intervenes, but it's always intervening in their affairs, not in the affair of peasants. Next week, we're going to talk about the prophets, and the prophets were the opposite. The prophets were the poor people who had something to say about this temple system, right? So that's the part of scripture that most Protestants lift up, because these are voices for the oppressed. These are voices for that were against the domination system, that spoke against empire, that spoke that you got to treat people fairly and you can't steal from the poor and all those kinds of things. We haven't seen any of that yet, right? All we've seen is the domination system fighting other domination systems around other kingdoms, and these are their stories, and while God was involved and there were prophets involved, um, it was still tied to the domination system of the ruling class. All right. So this kind of shows King Josiah. He was one of the last kings, like 620 to 600 BCE. He's the last great reforming king, and he had the temple repaired. It had gone since the time of Solomon, apparently without being kept up. So that's like 300 years. So he had the temple repaired. He had all of the different idols and stuff that were in the temple from the time of Solomon that were in the temple. He took them all out. The big cleansing of the temple was what Josiah did. And it says that as they were cleaning out the temple, they found the ancient scrolls of the Torah. So for 300 years, that was not part of what they were doing. It was not about what God said. It was just about this money-making system that the temple was, taxing and all those kinds of things. So they actually found the Torah and probably other books, some of the prophetic books probably. And they had a Passover for the first time, uh, since the Exodus, I think. It was, again, just a long, they had not celebrated Passover. So he reestablished the temple. So the temple, the story writers just loved Josiah. And he was a great reformer. He's the one, you can almost, some would say this is the start of Judaism right here. Some will say Judaism doesn't start until they come back from Babylon. But up to this point, they were Hebrew people who had a God named Yahweh that they cared about, but it's all just oral stuff. They didn't read the books. They didn't tell the stories to their kids where they're supposed to. And the temple system had fallen all away from that. It was just all about money. And so his reforms were very great. But when the Egyptians came up in 609 BC to attack the Assyrians, the prophets told Josiah, "Stay out of it. It's not your business." But he did. So he goes over and he attacks the Egyptians as they go up, and he's killed in battle. And that's the end of the great reforms of Josiah. So that's kind of what this one is all about. It's, I'm sure as you read this stuff, you're like, this is the temple system. This is what it was about. They have idols in there. What? They actually had even idols of child sacrifice in the temple. So it was not a cool place to be. At least not until Josiah's reformed, where then he where they started celebrating, but they started to become Jewish. They started to have a a a, a formal way of thinking and doing things. So that's what this slide is all about. All right. Any questions on what we've gone through so far? I promise next week it gets better. Next week it gets better. So we're going to get out First Kings. All right, so First Kings, chapter 1 we went over last week is about David dying and telling Solomon to kill off everybody. Chapter 2, he killed them off. So he killed all his rivals off, just like any king of any, that's what kings do, right? I'm the king, so let me kill off all my, any brothers or uncles that, may not be on my side. I'm gonna kill them off. So Solomon did that. Uh, in chapter 3, that's a great story where he asks God for wisdom, and God gives him wisdom, and he has the great story of the two prostitutes and the baby, and let's cut the baby in half, and uh, the real mother said, "Oh, don't do that," and that's how he knew the real mother. We all know that story. Uh, and chapter 4 is Solomon's wealth. So I just want to look at that just a little bit. All right. So it just talks about how everybody was responsible for to bring in all of the wealth of Solomon. Uh, and it was because of his great wisdom that he got, so if we go to verse 22 of chapter 4, it says Solomon's provision for one day was 30 cores of choice flour, 60 cores of meal, 10 fat oxen, and 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep, besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fatted fowl. For he had dominion over all the region west of the Euphrates, from Tishpa to Gaza, over all the kings of the west of the Euphrates, blah, blah, blah. So his people had to provide that for him. So the writer is writing this as this is the greatest stuff in the world. The chapters that follow it talk about all the gold he had and the silver and the crazy building that he did. And wealth doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from people. And the Bible, the First Kings here, is a classic story of the rich stealing from the poor for their own benefit. And Solomon was just pretty horrific at how brutal he was in doing that. So if we go to chapter 5, verse 15, says King Solomon conscripted forced labor out of all of Israel, not Judah, Israel. The levy numbered 30,000 men. He sent them to Lebanon, 10,000 a month in shifts. They would be a month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. Adoram was in charge of this forced labor. And Solomon also had several thousand laborers and 80,000 stonecutters in the hill country, besides Solomon's 3,300 supervisors who were over the work, having charge of the people who did the work at the king's command. They did all this stuff. So some of these stone cutters, some of them may have been paid, for their work. Most of them would not have been. That's how rich people become rich. They don't pay wages. And so it's just it just breaks your heart to think about, this is God and he created these people. And he said, you don't want a king, you don't want a king. Kings are going to rip you off. They always have and they always will. And the people just said, we need a king. Even though we know it's going to be bad, we need a king to protect us. And so that's what they got, and that's what they got. So it's kind of horrendous, in my opinion, anyway. Chapter 11 of First Kings talks about all of the other gods that were worshipped in the temple that King Solomon brought into the temple. So beginning, chapter 11, verse 1. King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the Israelites, you shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for they will surely incline your heart to follow their gods. Solomon clung to these in love. Among his wives were 700 princesses, 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and he didn't worship the one true God. And talks about all the abominations down below. Typical patriarch, it's the women's fault. It's not, he was just old, he couldn't help himself. I think we all can read that pretty clearly that this was Solomon did this, not anybody else. So this is him bringing all of these gods into the temple. All right, chapter 12 picks up when Rehoboam is king. King Solomon is now dead. Rehoboam is son, and this is I'll just read it, verse 1. Rehoboam, do I have to start at verse 1? Let me check. Yeah. Went to Shechem of Israel and said to the Shechem to make him king. When Jeroboam, son of Nebat, heard it, for he was still in Egypt, where he had fled from King Solomon. So this is him going up to the northern kingdom, and they say, your father made our yoke heavy. Now, therefore, lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke that was placed upon us, and we will serve you. So in verse 5, he says, well, go away, let me think about it. And then we pick back up and verse 14. He gets advice from the young man and said, my father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. So the king did not listen to the people, because it was a turn of affairs brought about by the Lord, that he might fulfill his word, which the Lord had spoken to Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam, son of Nebat. So this was the end of the kingdoms. They lighten their loads. He does not, all of the wealth was in the north. The south was still in it. There's nobody that's going to allow that system to continue. And so that was the end of the there's a short civil war, which was just kind of a joke because again, all the resources were in the north. All right. So chapter 14 is Egypt ransacks Jerusalem. So, you see that things are not going well from the very beginning. That they take things out of the temple. Chapter 16 is the story of Elijah and Saraphat the widow, which is one that we read in our lectionary. So that's a story that we all know, where she's out of food and miraculously she's not out of food. Uh, then we have the story of Elijah versus Ahab and the Baal prophets. So Baal was big, so Elijah has a big battle between him and the Baal prophets, where there's like 300 prophets, and God shuts up rain for 3 years, and um, Elijah just stands around and says, whenever you're done with get to all this monkey mook you guys are doing, I'll make it rain. So it didn't rain for 3 years. Then Elijah said, let it rain, and it rained. And of course, that was just to prove that Baal and Ashereth was not in charge of the weather, that the God of Israel was. All right. Then we have in chapter 20, God aids Ahab in battle. Ahab's been nothing good about him so far, and then all of a sudden God's on his side. And one of the things we should take note of here, maybe I should have mentioned it before, there's no mention of Satan. None. So in this time of the Bible, God did good things and God did bad things. Things that in later times people would say, well, Satan did that. God did the good things, Satan did the bad things. They didn't have that concept. So all things done, whether good or bad, were done by God. So it's just something to point out that you may or may not have just noticed as we go through. But Satan's not here, and God played the role of Satan as necessary to make the stories go. All right. So then we get to chapter 21. We got to read that story. So 1 Kings chapter 21. Later, the following events took place. Naboth the Jezreelite had a vineyard in Jezreel beside the palace of King Ahab of Samaria. And Ahab said to Naboth, give me your vineyard so that I may have it for a vegetable garden. Because it is near my house, I will give you a better vineyard for it. Or if it seems good to you, I will give you its value in money. But Naboth said to Ahab, the Lord forbid that I should give you my ancestral inheritance. So this is what we would call, where the government condemns your land so they can take it over, right? People don't like that, and this is a story of that very thing.
Eminent domain.
Say what?
Eminent domain.
Thank you. Think eminent domain. Yeah, we still love it today, don't we? Even though this most of famous story says don't go there. All right. Ahab went home resentful and sullen because of what Naboth the Jezreelite had said to him, for he had said, I will not give you my ancestral inheritance. He lay down on his bed, turned away his face, and would not eat. So he's having a temper tantrum. That's what kings do. His wife Jezebel came to him and said, why are you so depressed that you will not eat? He said to her, because I spoke to Naboth the Jezreelite and said to him, give me your vineyard for money, or else, if you prefer, I will give you another vineyard for it. But he answered, I will not give you my vineyard. His wife Jezebel said to him, Do you now govern Israel? Get up, eat some food, and be cheerful. I will give you the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite. So she wrote letters in Ahab's name and sealed them with his seal. She sent the letters to the elders and the nobles who lived in Naboth in his city. She wrote in the letters, proclaim a fast and set Naboth at the head of the assembly. Seat two scoundrels opposite him and have them bring a charge against him, saying, you have cursed God and the king. Then take him out and stone him to death. The men of his city, the elders and the nobles who lived in his city, did as Jezebel had said, and so that's what happened. So if you ever wondered why Jezebel is such a infamous name, this is why. This is the story that really made her uh, just totally corrupt. Uh, and she also sits for a while, her daughter was king of Judah or queen of Judah. You can imagine how well that went. So this is Jezebel, famous name. You still hear it all the time today. You're being a Jezebel, that kind of stuff. And this is where it comes from. All right. So then we're going to go to Second Kings. There's so many good stories here. We just, they're they're just not central to keep the story going, but they're fun to read. And they talk about, I mean, they're not just fun to read, but they talk about, you know, being a follower of God versus not being a follower of God. That's what so many of these stories are about. But Second Kings chapter 2, another famous story, verse 1. Now, when the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven by a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on the way from Gilgal. Elijah said to Elisha, stay here, for the Lord has sent me as far as Bethel. But Elisha said, as the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you. So they went down to Bethel, and the company of prophets who were in Bethel came out to Elisha and said to him, do you know that today the Lord will take your master away from you? And he said, yes, I know, keep silent. So further down there, it just talks about he tries to send Elisha away, and Elisha said, I'm not going to go away. I'm going to see you here, and as you're taken away. And he asked for a blessing. That's always important. In chapter 9 or verse 9, it says, when they had crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, tell me what I may do for you before I am taken from you. Elisha said, please let me inherit a double share of your spirit. He responded, you have asked a hard thing, yet if you see me as I am being taken from you, it will be granted you. If not, it will not. As they continued walking and talking, a chariot of fire and horses of fire separated the two of them, and Elijah ascended in a whirlwind into heaven. Elisha kept watching and crying out, Father, Father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. But when he could no longer see him, he grasped his own clothes and tore them in two pieces. So this is the famous story of Elijah being taken to heaven in a chariot of fire. He did not die as all mortals do. He was taken to heaven. So Elijah and Elisha are just great prophets. Um, when Jesus asked the disciples who he is, and like, well, are you Elijah? You're so that's one of the names they bring up to say that who he is. Of course, we know him being greater than that. All right, chapter 5, which another great story, but what are we doing? Another great story, but it's one we read in the lectionary, so I'm not going to go over it. But we're naming the general as leprosy. And he comes to Elisha, and Elisha says, just, dip yourself 3 times and you'll be cured. And he goes away mad because he wants to do something amazing. But finally he does it and he's healed. So that's a story we should be familiar with because we read it every 3 years in script in worship. All right, so now we're going to go to chapter 18. So a lot of stories of Elisha here we're going to skip over. Chapter 18, we'll pick up with the history. Chapter 18, verse 9. In the 4th year of King Hezekiah, which was the 7th year of King Hoshea, son of Eliah of Israel, King Shalmaneser of Assyria came up against Samaria, besieged it, that at the end of 3 years took it. In the 6th year of King Hezekiah, which was the 9th of King Hoshea of Israel, Samaria was taken. The king of Assyria carried the Israelites away to Assyria, settled them in Halah on the Habor and the river of Gozan in the cities of the Medes, because they did not obey the voice of the Lord their God, but transgressed his covenant. All that Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded, they neither listened nor obeyed. So they were punished. They were punished for not doing as God asked them to do. And the punishment was they were carted off as slaves into foreign lands. So, up to this point, God was in their temples. For Judah, it was in the temple in Jerusalem. For the Samaritans, it was in Dan and Bethel. That's where God was. Now they're not there anymore. So it's very traumatic to think that they're no longer in, not only have they lost their ancestral home, but have lost everything. God's no longer with them because God is in Jerusalem. God is in Bethel. So it's just very devastating to what happened to them. So the Assyrians were a warlike people. They treated people terribly. They controlled people through terror. So what they suffered was not good. I'll just leave it at that. We're also going to see that he goes down and besieges Jerusalem. And he's going to make them pay tribute. So they have to pay him all this gold and all this silver. So he doesn't destroy the whole place. And from then on, Judah was never more than, it was a vassal state. They had their own kings and all that kind of stuff. But now they were vassals of Assyria and later Babylon. So what does that mean to the people? That means that the people have to pay more taxes because they have to pay the tax to keep their country going. And they also have to pay the tax for the tribute. So the Assyrians and the Babylonians later on will leave them alone. So again, just a great burden on the people. As bad as the rulers talk about here, the people were suffering far more than what we see in the official story here of what the ruling class says. All right. So we just read that. So now we're going to skip all the way to chapter 22, verse 1. Says Josiah was 8 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 31 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Jedediah, daughter of Yeah. He did what was right in the sight of the Lord, walked in all the way of his father David. He did not turn aside to the right or to the left. So this guy is getting all the high marks. In the 18th year of King Josiah, the king sent Shaphan, son of Azaliah, son of, well, these names, uh, go up to the high priest Hilkiah and give him account of the entire sum of money that has been brought into the house of the Lord, which the keepers of the threshold have collected from the people. Let it be given into the hand of the workers who have the oversight of the house of the Lord. Let them give it to the workers who are at the house of the Lord repairing the house. That is, to the carpenters, to the builders, to the masons. He let them use it to buy timber and quarried stone to repair the house, but no accounting shall be asked from them for the money that is delivered into the hand, for they deal honestly. So, 18 years, right? He ruled for 18 years, and now all of a sudden he's being super generous and he's going to pay people to repair the temple. I'm not buying it, right? The people revolted. They had their own little revolution. They said, we're not going to put up with this anymore. And all of a sudden, not only is a temple being built, the people are getting paid for doing it. It's just not sucking the life out of them, right? So again, they're writing it from the standpoint of the ruling class. They're not going to say that part. They're not going to say the part about the little peons made us give up everything. No, we did it out of the goodness out of our own heart because we're just great Hebrew men. Uh, it's still a good thing to happen. I'm not saying that, but I'm sure there's a bit of uh, a little revolution that was going on behind the scenes there. All right, let's continue reading here. The high priest, I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. Whoa. So they found the Torah and maybe other prophetic writings in the house of the Lord. All these years, nobody had read it. Your servants have emptied out the money that was found in the house and have delivered it into the hand of the workers who have oversight of the house of the Lord. The priest Hilkiah has given me a book. Stephen then read it aloud to the king. When the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his clothes. Then the king commanded the priest Hilkiah, man, these names, they should all be David and George. So that's enough. The point is that for 300 years, they had not read the book. The Torah was there, it was in the temple. Uh, some would say it probably wasn't in the temple until the northern kingdom fell, and that's when it went there. Nobody knows. But at any rate, it wasn't read in the temple for 300 years. They found it and said, oh, looky here, look what I found. And now Josiah is part of the reform is we're going to read what the book says, and they celebrated a Passover. And that's in chapter 23, verse 23 to 25 is that little where they celebrate the Passover. Then we're going to go to chapter 24, verse 10. Chapter 24, verse 10. At that time, the servants of King Nebuchadnezzar, there's a name we know, of Babylon came up to Jerusalem, and the city was besieged. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to the city while his servants were besieging it. King Jehoiachin of Judah gave himself up to the king of Babylon, himself, his mother, his servants, his officers, his palace officials. The king of Babylon took him prisoner in the 8th year of his reign. So the king, you know, they didn't burn the city down, but they didn't burn it down because they got what they wanted. So if the royal court's going, so's the tribute. So he carried off all the treasures of the house of the Lord, the treasures of the king's house. He cut in pieces all the vessels of gold in the temple of the Lord, which King Solomon of Israel had made. All of this as the Lord had foretold. He carried away all of Jerusalem, all the officials, all the warriors, 10,000 captives, all the artisans, the smiths. No one remained except the poorest people of the land. He carried away Jehoiachin to Babylon, the king's mother, his wives, the artisans, blah, blah, blah. So this was really, it was the end of Judah at this point. And then we're going to go to chapter 25, verse 1. It says, Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. And in the 9th year of the 10th day of the month, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came with all of his army against Jerusalem, laid siege to it. And they built siege works against it all around, so the city was besieged until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. On the 9th day of the 4th day, the famine became so severe in the city there was no food for the people of the land. A breach was made in the city wall. The king of all the soldiers fled by night, away of the gate, by the king's garden. They went into the direction of who cares where they went. And this time they burnt the city down. So they came the first time and they took the royal court. They took all the wealth. And then 10 years later, they rebelled and said, no, we're not going to be Babylonians anymore. They rebelled. Jeremiah told them not to rebel, which we'll get to next week, but they did. So now everything, the whole town, like Jerusalem, is burnt to the ground. And that's the end of the complete end of the story of Israel. 25. So, missing something here. I didn't mark it right. 25, 1 to 7. So anyway, here I can't find it just right now for whatever reason, but in here it talks about they killed all of his sons in front of him and plucked his eyes out. And then they made him sit at the king's table. So they put him in jail for a while, but they made him sit at the king's table. So as a way of humiliation, but also from the Jewish standpoint of a way of like, there's hope. There's hope. This is the lineage of David. So when the last king died in Babylon, that was the end of the lineage of David and the kingship of the people of Israel until Jesus was born. So Jesus, of the lineage of David, is in fact the fulfillment of the promise that God made to David that his offspring would be kings of Israel forever, because now Jesus is the King of Israel who will live forever. So that's kind of how our Christian part of the story taps in to the end of the kingdoms here. Sad story, but there's not that many kingdoms that last. for 300 years or for 500 years. You know, the Assyrians didn't last, the Babylonians didn't last, the Persians didn't last, you know, Greek Macedonians didn't last. Romans lasted a long time, but they didn't last forever. So that's just the way of nations, you know. So our nation is probably not going to be any different than that, sad to say. And that, you know, history will teach us that what we have won't be forever, and that something else will come along. Again, as much as we hate to say and think about such things, that's what history might teach us. So any questions or comments about what we've gone through tonight? We've a lot of stories we've gone through, a lot we just don't have time for. But is there anything you read that you'd like to bring out? Oh, that's a cool story. This is your time to speak up and say something. Okay. So again, next week we're gonna hear from the prophets. You know, thus saith the Lord. So as this story that we've just read was all unfolding, and we're like, where's the justice in this? Where's, you know, where's the rightness of all this? This is just not good story after not good story after not good story. And next week we're going to be reading of the prophets in the exact same time frame that we just read, except now it's going to be not the issue of worshiping in the temple. It's going to be not caring for the widow and the orphan. You know, that's the big thing of what the prophets were saying. While all of this crazy wars and bondage and slavery and all this is going on, there's no mention of who cares about the poor. Solomon enslaved them. All the kings did. That's just how life was. The prophets said, no, 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 you can't claim that you're a good king. The temple can't claim it's a good temple if you're not taking care of the least of these. So what we read is they lost everything because they didn't worship God in the temple and worshiped idols. The prophets are going to give us a totally different story of the same time frame and says, because you were not generous kings to your people, you're carted off. So just get in your head, these prophets next week are the exact same time frame of what we've just read of what the kings did. I think that's probably enough. So enjoy your reading this week. So it gets better finally. We finally get to the part that we understand and that we use most of the prophets in our liturgies. And they speak in contrast to systems of domination. And they make sense in our world today because we too live in a world of empires and domination systems. So with that said, if there's no other comments or questions, I will close with prayer. Let us pray. Gracious God, we thank you that you love us so much. We thank you for all that you have created. We thank you for revealing yourself in your word and the stories that we are reading and we'll read as we continue our journey through Scripture. And Lord, we ask that you would help and to open our minds and hearts to what you're trying to tell your people here in this time and in our place, so that we can be more faithful, so we can understand to whom we belong and for what purpose you have for our lives. We ask that you would bless our readings, that you would bless our prayers as we go through this week. And Lord, we also have to ask, bless this country as we go through this such divisive election, that whatever the outcome, Lord, let divisions stop. Let love prevail. Let healing occur. Let us become what you have created us to become. We ask this in the precious name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.
Yeah.
Good night.
Thank you, Pastor.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good night.